Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Rachel Potter.
Thank you so much. Yes, so I am a professor of English literature at the University of East Anglia, and I'm a specialist in early 20th century literature and culture. And I wrote a book called Obscene Modernism, which is about a number of books, a lot of books that were censored in the early 20th century on the grounds that they were obscene. So I looked at the kind of different mechanisms by which that censorship took place. And then more recently, I've got interested in the other side of the equation, so to speak. So what were the arguments that writers and lawyers put forward to defend literary works from censorship? And that led me to find out about this writers' organization called International PEN. So International PEN was founded in 1921, but it's still very much going strong. It's a global writers' organization. And they committed themselves to defending freedom of expression in 1934. And that was because in 1933, the Berlin PEN Center had been taken over by Nazi members. And they had immediately excluded Jewish and socialist writers from the PEN Center. So effectively, after that, International PEN excluded the Berlin PEN Center from the international organization because they were interested in free speech, and obviously the Nazi PEN members had clamped down on that. But it's interesting that their commitment to freedom of expression was basically shaped by the rise to power of the Nazis in Germany and within the PEN Center itself. So, free speech, free expression, it's rarely out of the headlines. There's lots of discussion of free speech in political terms, in journalism, and online. But in a situation where the Vice President of the United States can say that European countries have jettisoned freedom of speech, what do we actually mean when we talk about free speech? Freedom of expression is a very important right in declarations, in constitutions, and in political philosophy, particularly liberal political philosophy. And within those discourses, it's never meant the right to say whatever one likes. There are always questions about the boundaries of freedom of expression. So what qualifies as speech, free speech, or free expression? And at what point should the freedom to express be limited, either because it might cause harm to another individual, or because it might infringe rights to privacy, or it might undermine the authority of the state, or it might lead to social breakdown? There have always been boundaries on the right to freedom of expression. So, in this lecture, I'm going to look at the following questions. Why is freedom of expression important? Should there be limits on the freedom to express? Why have governments been so fearful of literary texts? I'm just going to give you a short history of some banned books in the UK. What does this tell us about why literature is important? And then I'm going to think about the key ways in which literary expression was defended in these cases. So when I say that free speech has always been defined by its boundaries, I guess what that means is that there's always a balance between free expression and harm. And that's decided upon differently in different democracies. And it's very much dependent on different histories and societal norms that they shape. But when the claim is made that someone has a right to free speech, it tends to mean that they have a moral right that ought to be protected by the law. It does not necessarily mean that they have the right to cause mayhem or to gratuitously abuse or dehumanize someone else. A famous example of the former is shouting fire in a crowded theatre. This is a paraphrase of something that Oliver Wendell Holmes said in 1919 in a case called Schenck versus the United States. And what he said was, the most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man falsely shouting fire in a theatre and causing a panic. The question in every case is whether the words used in such circumstances are of such a nature to create a clear and present danger that they will bring about the substantive evils that Congress has a right to prevent. And I guess an instance of the latter would be hate speech targeting a group or individual based on inherent characteristics that has potential to cause significant harm. Sometimes free speech is invoked politically or in the culture wars, and I think its privileged status is referenced and kind of exploited, while it is used to signify in ways that are contrary to the tradition or arguments that underpin its privileged status. But what do I mean when I say that free expression is a privileged right? In liberal philosophy, it is particularly important. Some arguments as to why it is important are consequentialist, which basically means that it produces something important. So free speech produces important things. A functioning democracy, for instance, or truths that benefit society, or as John Stuart Mill put it, the livelier idea of truth through its collision with error. Some arguments are deontological. They arise from first principles. Speech is important in and of itself, both to the producer and the recipient of speech. It is foundational to individual autonomy and self-fulfillment, and individuals only develop if they are free to communicate their ideas and to hear or read the ideas of others. And if you just look at the slide above, and if that you find that that's irritating or that it makes you angry, you'll see why the rights of the person to hear ideas are really just as important in the arguments about free speech as the right to actually express or speak an idea. They're both incredibly important. That image immediately makes one think, well, why have you got the right to block those words out? You know, why have you got the right to decide for me whether I can and cannot read those words? So in liberal philosophy, political speech is particularly important. The arguments vary as to why this is, but just some of the main ones are. First, free speech is important because it allows us to exchange truth for falsehood. Free speech is important because the free exchange of opinions is fundamental to functioning democracy, because it enables equality of treatment and the self-realization and individual autonomy that produces informed participation in democratic decision-making. 3, it protects deliberative debate and the free exchange of opinion in the pursuit of truth, or what Oliver Wendell Holmes famously described as the marketplace of ideas in the ongoing quest for truth. 4th, it is important because even if an opinion is false, it allows for the livelier, or more robust understanding of truth. As John Stuart Mill argued, it prevents truths becoming lazy truths or dogma, as he called it. Now, all of those arguments I've summarised relate to opinions. But in this lecture, I'm talking about literature, banned literary books and literary texts. And while novels sometimes express opinions, that's certainly not all that they express. Poems don't really express opinions as such. Some literary texts express ideas, but they tend not to make arguments. Novels are more likely to stage different ideas alongside one another, or ideas that clash against one another. So, defences of the free expression of literary works have mined some of the arguments, the broader arguments about political speech. Literary texts are described as forms of expression that are part of self-realization as an end in itself. The right to write or read literary works produces individual autonomy. They have been defended as important forums for the pursuit of truth, not scientific truth, but moral, psychological, or emotional truth. A different argument from the other way around, so to speak, is to say that while free expression is constrained because of its potential harms, literature has often been defended as expression whose harms are hard to prove. A literary text has to be considered with reference to its literariness, its literary form. Its form is not incidental to its meaning. It is intrinsic to what it is. And in this sense, a literary text is often, the language is playful, it's open-ended, it's multivocal. It's hard to see how a literary text as a whole qualifies as a kind of expression that intends to lead to significant harm. Every November, the Writers' Organisation International PEN, that I've just mentioned at the beginning, organises a day of the imprisoned writer. And it highlights 4 writers who are in prison in different parts of the world. Last November, it focused on 4 writers, and they included Jimmy Lai, who's a Hong Kong journalist and pro-democracy activist, who's been in prison since 2020. And Katyarina Andreeva, who's a journalist and poet, who is in prison in Belarus. The writers highlighted by PEN are a mix of journalists and literary writers, most of whom have combined writing with human rights activism. I think the image of the writer behind bars is probably the most powerful symbol that we have of an author deprived of their liberty because of what they have written. Perhaps also there's no better symbol of why the freedom to express is so important. It seems like a terrible violation of liberty to be put behind bars because of something one has written, because the harms of what someone has written would have to be very profound for that to be justified. But of course, there are other ways in which the freedom to express has been constrained. Books can be burnt or prohibited, or the publishers of books or journals can be taken to court and fined for contravening laws on obscenity, sedition, blasphemy, or libel. There is nothing new about being put in prison or physically attacked, even killed, for what one has written, and books being burnt or burned because of the dangers they pose. And this image behind you is something that was created by an artist called Marta Minuhin. She created a striking visual image of the scale of banned books in her art installation. She first erected it in Buenos Aires in 1983, and she called it the Parthenon of Books, after the Greek temple to democracy. It was built of more than 20,000 banned books, including literary works by Jean-Paul Sartre, Ernest Hemingway, Jorge Luis Borges, and more. She viewed it as a monument to the restoration of democracy in Argentina in 1982. She recreated the installation in 2017 in Kassel, Germany, at the site where Nazis had once burnt over 2,000 books by Jewish and communist writers. Menuhin's installation is a striking visual image of the scale and the politics of banned books. In the historical monument of the Buenos Aires Parthenon and the geographical placement of the Kassel Parthenon, she invites the viewer to connect the banning of books to authoritarian governance, as well as to consider its significance in the transition from authoritarianism to democracy and from democracy to authoritarianism. The Parthenon obviously looks to the ancient Greek monument to democracy and also invokes the Greek ideas of parrhesia, or translated to mean speaking truth with candor. The open and sincere expression of viewpoints seen as central to Athenian governance. The structure is also a powerful symbol of the centrality of banned books to what it is that we know. Without the works that comprise the structure, the sum total of human knowledge would be entirely different. Once banned books are our shared historical knowledge. So the structure also alerts us to something else. If so many of the most significant books in world history have been banned, that tells us something about the instinct to control the dissemination of new knowledge and what others are able to read and to know, and also something about the power of literature. In the UK, many of the works that now make up the literary canon, the literature taught in schools and at universities, were, on publication, deemed to be obscene, blasphemous, or seditious. There has, in fact, been a close connection between what we consider to be good literature, literary or aesthetic value, and the transgression of legal prohibitions. Partly for this reason, literary writers have had a lot to say about freedom of expression and why it is important. As Menuhin's structure suggests, historically authoritarian governments and their supporters don't have much interest in defending free expression. Nazi students flung thousands of literary works onto fires in 1933, including those of Bertolt Brecht, Thomas Mann, and Franz Kafka. Writers regularly testify to what they see as the authoritarian regime's exaggerated anxieties about novels, poems, and plays. Egyptian writer Taha Hussein put it in the 1950s, fear of freedom is the pitfall of oppression. Fear of literature is the pitfall of oppression. And J.M. Coetzee, in the 1990s essay on censorship in South Africa, describes the fear of insecure regimes and of dictatorships, in particular of literature and mockery, arguing that there is a particular kind of paranoia about literature. As Margaret Atwood has said it much more recently, when your regime is under pressure, a little book burning creates a popular distraction. Writers don't have an army, and they're so easy to blame. In democratic structures, the rationale for censoring literary works tends to be a bit different, although there are often crossovers. And it tends to go on a logic of wanting to protect other people. It's always other people who need protection from harm. John Stuart Mill, in his famous essay, on free expression argued that, and these are my highlighted words, the sole end for which mankind are warranted, individually or collectively, in interfering with the liberty of action of any of their number is self-protection. That the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. He cannot rightfully be compelled to do or forbear because it will be better for him to do so, because it will make him happier, because, in the opinions of others, to do so would be wise or even right. So Mill insisted that people should be free to express themselves unless that expression creates harm to others. A person's own moral good, their happiness, or the fact that it would be wise or right for them not to read something, that's not a sufficient reason for banning it, according to Mill. But in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries in the UK, books were frequently banned on precisely such grounds. So one of the reasons given was, we need to control what people can read because we know what is best for them. Or second, we need to control what people can read because they are corruptible, or easily manipulated, or succumb to propaganda or lies. And there were specific groups of people who were seen as particularly open to being corrupted, and that was the newly literate working class and young women in particular. In this period, many books were banned on the grounds of their obscenity. In 1959, the new Obscene Publications Act was ushered in with a specific provision to defend works on the ground of their literary merit. But prior to that, from 1857 until 1959, many literary works were banned under the 1857 Obscene Publications Act. And when it was being ushered through Parliament, Lord Campbell said the following about it. This is the first quote up there. It was intended to apply exclusively to works written for the single purpose of corrupting the morals of youth and of a nature calculated to shock the common feelings of decency in any well-regulated mind. But it was left to the courts to come up with a definition of obscenity. There was no definition of obscenity in the Act. And that happened in 1868 in a case that became known as the Hicklin Act. And this is the second quote on the sheet. It said, and the definition of obscenity was that a work would have a tendency to deprave and corrupt those whose minds are open to such immoral influences and into whose hands a publication of this sort may fall. So you can see that there's been a real shift between those two things. Intention has been replaced with tendency. A well-regulated mind has been replaced with a mind which is open to such immoral influences. Lots of books were banned because the second bit of that is so loose, it's so general, that pretty much anything could be considered obscene under that definition. There were three main ways in which books were targeted. First, a private prosecution could be brought by concerned citizens or organizations, such as the National Vigilance Society. Second, the Director of Public Prosecutions could decide to bring an action on behalf of the state under the 1857 Obscene Publications Act. And third, the third method of dealing with obscene materials was by way of the Customs Consolidation Act of 1876. This allowed an order to be issued banning the import of an obscene book produced abroad. No justification was needed, and the right to appeal was limited. So the books were basically seized at the port or airport of entry or in the mail. So James Joyce's Ulysses was prohibited in the UK through the Customs Consolidation Act. Episodes of Ulysses, which is now considered one of the best novels of the 20th century, they'd been published in an American journal called the Literary Review, and they included an episode called Nausicaa, which involves explicit descriptions of the protagonist, Leopold Bloom, masturbating and ejaculating while ogling a 17-year-old girl called Gertie. So legal action in the States was initiated by an organization called the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, and the editors were taken to court in 1921 in New York and prosecuted for publishing an obscene work. The complete book of Ulysses was only published in 1922, and it was published in Paris. It came to the attention of the UK authorities when a reviewer called Shane Leslie reviewed it and judged it that it contains passages that are fantastically opposed to all ideas of good taste and morality. It was, he claimed, experimental, anti-conventional, anti-Christian, chaotic, and totally unmoral. The Home Office, though, was not initially very interested in pursuing the book because they thought, because it was an expensive book, it would mean that it was prohibitive. In other words, the general reader would not be able to get hold of it, and that, from their point of view, was fine. The problem arose when a customs officer called Fletcher found a copy of the novel at Croydon Aerodrome. He sent a letter to the Home Office asking for clarification about what to do. He admitted the book seemed indecent, but he also pointed out that the book was a work of art by an author of considerable repute who was being discussed and reviewed in elite journals. He pointed to page 704 of the novel and asked for guidance. Page 704 of the novel is in the final episode. It's called Penelope. And it focuses on the interior monologue of a character called Molly Bloom, who is married to Leopold Bloom, and who is lying in bed musing on the extramarital sex she has enjoyed earlier in the day. And I just read this. This is from page 704. Yes, I think he made them a bit firmer, sucking them like that, so long he made me thirsty, titties he calls them. I had to laugh, yes, this one anyway, stiff, the nipple gets, for the least thing. I'll get him to keep that up, and I'll take those eggs beaten up with masala, fatten them out for him. What are all those veins supposed to represent? Beauty, placed up there like those statues in the museum, one of them pretending to hide it with her hand. Are they so beautiful? Of course, compared with what a man looks like with his 2 bags full and his other thing hanging down out of him, or sticking up at you like a hat rack. No wonder they hide it with a cabbage leaf, and it goes on. So the whole of this episode is, there is no punctuation. It's her just musing on this and other sorts of things. So there are aspects to this novel which, by the standards of the day, are very sexually explicit, let's put it that way. But, as my mention of Nausicaa and Penelope and the title of the novel Ulysses suggests, the book is much more than just simply a description of sexually explicit passages. It was modelled partly on Homer's Odyssey. It's extremely experimental and plays with an extraordinary array of literary styles. And it depicts in detail an ordinary day in Dublin in 1904. However, when the Director of Public Prosecutions read this page and others, he was very shocked. And he said, "It is written as if composed by a more or less illiterate woman, vulgar woman, and it is certainly obscene. And he marked up specific passages and passed it to the Undersecretary of State, who found them foul in their obscenity. So Ulysses was now banned from entering the UK. In April 1923, a consignment of 499 copies was seized at Folkestone. When individuals tried to get hold of the book, including F.R. Leavis, who was a famous literary critic from Cambridge University, he wanted to get hold of a copy because he wanted to teach it as part of a lecture series on modern literature in 1926. And he was refused that and then subjected to Home Office surveillance. What was seen as particularly kind of dangerous was that F.R. Leavis had planned to teach the book to a mixed class of men and women. So you see how this issue of who's going to get hold of the book runs right through this, the legal shenanigans connected to this book. The publishers fought back, though. In 1936, the publisher Lane forced the hand of the government by planning a publication of Ulysses. In a meeting between the Home Office, the DPP, and the Attorney General, Sir Donald Somerville, the latter ruled that no action should be taken against the proposed publication of Ulysses. He questioned the Hicklin formula that I quoted earlier and argued that rather than a tendency to corrupt, both the intention and the context needed to be taken into account. He proposed the general principle that, and this is a quote, no book which had any pretensions to be treated as a serious work should be prosecuted except by the DPP. So Ulysses was now free. But I think the case reveals a series of conflicting ideas about obscenity and fiction. While many literary reviewers, the customs officer, and then later Somerville, all identified this as a work of art, or a serious work, as Somerville said, that was irrelevant to those who judged it to be obscene. The issue of whether it was going to be available to the general reader was also paramount. But the literary merit argument put by Somerville could be invoked behind the scenes in these discussions. It would not have been relevant legally. If it had gone to trial, it would not have been relevant in a legal sense. That's the direction of travel that the law is going on, but the law would only change in 1959, and that was 23 years in the future. In 1928, Jonathan Cape, the publisher of Radcliffe Hall's novel The Well of Loneliness, was taken to court in London on the direction of the DPP and under the Obscene Publications Act. The novel is a sincere portrait of the development of a lesbian woman called Stephen from birth to adulthood. Unlike Ulysses, there is no explicit sexual description at all. The most sexually explicit moment in the text is when we are told, and this is the quote there, Stephen bent down and kissed Mary's hands very humbly, for now she could find no words anymore, and that night they were not divided. This takes place in a novel which is a kind of novel of development, we might call it a Bildungsroman, which just stages Stephen's gradual growth and realization of her sexuality. The action was spearheaded by a journalist called James Douglas, who was a columnist for the Sunday Express. Sorry, that should say the Sunday Express. And under the title, A Book That Must Be Suppressed, he basically invited the DPP to take action. I've just reproduced the words that are in dark type there because you can't read them. He said, that is the defense and justification of what I regard as an intolerable outrage, the first outrage of this kind in the annals of English fiction. The answer is that the adroitness and cleverness of the book intensifies its moral danger. So here he basically says that the fact the book was well written with adroitness and cleverness intensified its danger. And he famously likened the book to poison. He said, "I would rather give a healthy boy or a healthy girl a phial of prussic acid than this novel. Poison kills the body, but moral poison kills the soul." So he's basically saying that the moral harm that this book can unleash is more profound than being physically harmed by ingesting lethal poison. It's a kind of reversal of Mill's argument about harm. The idea that the literary merit of the book made it more rather than less dangerous was repeated by the judge, Lord Byron, in his judicial summing up. He decided that the book would induce thoughts of a most impure character and glorify a horrible tendency. His problem with the book, then, is not about its sexually explicit descriptions. It's actually about the idea that it expresses and the fact that it is well written. It's because it's about lesbian sexuality, obviously. At that time, male homosexuality was illegal and punishable by imprisonment, while female homosexuality was not even seen to exist legally. Lots of writers came out to defend Hall and The Well of Loneliness. They were horrified that this book had been banned. That included Virginia Woolf, E.M. Forster, Leonard Woolf, and many others. Cape immediately transferred the operations to Paris and produced the book from there, and it became a global bestseller. This is what happens if you take a book to court. It always becomes so well publicized that it becomes a global bestseller. So the whole kind of aim of banning it is always backfires. The law did change, though, in 1959, and it introduced this new clause that there would be a protection for literary works, and not only that the testimony of experts could be called upon to argue the case for the literary merit of a particular work. And this led to the famous trial of Lady Chatterley's lover in 1960. Penguin Books basically decided to bring out a paperback edition of the novel, and the fact that this novel was going to be very cheap and available to the general reader was also an issue in the trial. But it became a test case, and in the end, as you probably already all know, Lady Chatterley's lover was acquitted. But it was quite interesting what happened in the arguments within that trial, too. So the prosecution argued that it does tend, certainly that may tend to induce lustful thoughts in the minds of those who read it. But then the prosecution said the following: "Would you approve of your young sons, your young daughters, because girls can read as well as boys, reading this book? Is it a boy that you would want your wife or your servants to read?" And at that point, the whole of the courtroom, including the jury, because there were 3 women on the jury, they all started laughing. And I think at that point, the defense thought, we've won this case. Because basically, the prosecuting solicitor was invoking a kind of world that was disappearing. You know, things had changed. There were women on the jury, and the idea that you would have servants was sort of ridiculous. So the trial kind of, they felt that kind of, the defense felt, oh, well, maybe we've won it at this point. But it was also interesting in the trial that the defense lawyer wanted to press on this idea of harm. He insisted that to corrupt means a tendency to change, to make morally bad, to pervert, to result in someone doing that. That's my stress, which he would not otherwise have done if he had not read the book. And that the test case now was whether the book would involve a change of character leading the reader to do something. So basically saying, you would have to prove that this novel actually created some kind of actual activity in the world, some kind of harm that is tangible and physical. The history that I've sketched has shown some of the details and debates surrounding the banning of significant literary works in the UK, and we've seen some unfolding discussions about boundaries and at what point it's justifiable to limit what someone can write and publish or read. The defence of literary freedom has often rested on strong claims about the formal autonomy of the literary text and its disconnection from causing harm. And this idea that a literary text has to be judged as a whole is also very important. It's very hard to think about how a literary text creates direct stimulation to harm or incitement to harm. I think it's interesting in that the cases of Ulysses, The Well of Loneliness, and Lady Chatterley's Lover, the prosecution argued that they created moral corruption, but the defense involved trying to shift the focus from corruption to harm. And literary texts in all of these cases are defended in terms of their seriousness. They're serious works. They're not gratuitously offensive. They're not gratuitously obscene. So I guess in the UK, since the test case of Lady Chatterley's Lover, there have been other cases of books being taken to court, but by and large, the censorship of literary texts has ceased. But it's not the end of the story. So in the US, as we were saying earlier, there have been endeavours to control what young people can read, and that's become important, and it has increased in recent years. PEN America, since 2021, has compiled statistics about book bans in schools and universities, and their statistics record a significant increase. So while there were 2,532 book bans in 2021, there were 10,046 in 2023 to 2024. These bans include a combination of local campaigns and state laws. Florida and Iowa, for instance, recorded the highest number of book bans because both states introduced statutory processes for banning books. PEN America has analysed the content of the most commonly banned books for 2023 to 4. Most include books with people of colour, books with LGBTQ plus people and characters. Over half included sex-related themes. Now, many of those books are aimed at young people, but among the 19 most banned books were Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, and Alice Walker's The Colour Purple. The reasons given for this will be familiar to us by now, I hope. It is to protect young people from moral harm. But as Megan Nelson has put it, caring and coercion can exist in a knot. And that knot can justify jettisoning some of the arguments I have outlined in this talk. So, just to summarise, in this talk, I've suggested why, historically and philosophically, the freedom to express has been seen as important. I've also suggested that free expression has always been defined in relation to boundaries. I've delved into the history in the UK of government attempts to limit literary free expression and the reasons that were given. These cases reveal a lot about defences of literary freedom. These arguments, in turn, are also a bit about literary value. A literary text has to be taken as a whole and read with reference to its literariness or literary form. Form is not incidental part of its meaning, but is intrinsic to it. To justifiably prohibit a literary text, it would be necessary to prove that it creates significant harm. The justification of banning texts has often involved the claim that they will corrupt the minds of readerships judged in advance. So the young women, for instance. They're judged to be easily corruptible. But as John Stuart Mill argued, deciding what is morally good for someone else and protecting it is not a sufficient reason for prohibiting expression. Thank you very much.